So today I put this on this. Oh boy. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So for today's video, we are taking apart the rear suspension of the Model 3. Now, if you are doing anything from replacing the rear knuckle assembly, which is the purpose for this video for me today, or rear wheel bearings, rear brakes, rear axle, any one of the rear suspension arms, then this is a video for you. Go ahead and watch it through. Again, I'm replacing the suspension knuckles, left and right side. You'll be seeing me do the driver's side, left side of the car today, but I did the driver's side yesterday. But this work is what all of these steps is what you'll need to take to do the rear knuckle, as I've done, or wheel bearings, or the rear CV axle assembly, any one of the 4 suspension control arms, or the rear brakes. So all of those things, or also the ABS sensor. So all of those things are covered in this one video. So let's dig into it. Step 1 of this process is to jack the car up. I'm actually going to jack up both sides of the car, even though I'm only showing the one side today. And there's a couple of reasons for that, not the least of which is I'm going to be rotating, flipping the right side rear to the left side rear tires in the car. So, but it's also easier to work on when it's evenly jacked up, and there's a specific component within the suspension that is easier to cope with when it's jacked up evenly on both sides, and I'll get into that once it's jacked up. So let's go ahead and get it off the ground. All right, so you can see I've already got the car jacked up, both wheels taken off, and so you can see here I'm using my wonderful Safe jack stands. These were given to me as for a product review last year sometime, and they are fantastic. I'm using them on both sides. You'll notice that I also have the jack underneath. The jack is underneath with some level of pressure up against the jack stand. That's just added safety. The other side is just the jack stand, but I'm working on this side, and just as a precaution, I have the jack underneath the jack stand as well. So first step to servicing the knuckle assembly is to get the caliper and rotor off. Now there's a couple facets to this that are a little bit strange. So with most cars, it's not a problem. You take the caliper off and you can pull the rotor off. However, with a Tesla, if somebody is not sitting in the driver's seat, the calipers are locked. It's in parking mode, which is to lock the caliper. So the caliper is locked to the rotor. Now, one kind of neat little tip or little fact about these cars: the caliper is held on with screws from the bolts from the back. So if you remove those 2 bolts, you can take the caliper and rotor off as a unit, and then I hang it by a piece of wire from the coil spring. So that way you can do this by yourself. But there is you do need to be aware that when you pull the hub off of the axle, the splines come out, and you need to make sure that the hub is oriented correctly on those splines. There's a couple ways to do that. One, you can mark the hub in relation to the backing plate, so you can get the splines back in correctly. With the right side, I didn't do that. I had done the right side yesterday, so I didn't record it. I was in a hurry, plus I wanted to work out all the bugs and details of this repair before I film it. So now I'm filming the driver's side, and I realized that I took a picture of it on the right side, and I was able to look at the picture and line up the hub and get it back on, so that, because if you don't line up the hub correctly on the splines, then the lugs won't line up and the caliper's locked to the rotor and you're stuck. You have to take it apart to line it back up again. So make sure that you have the lugs in their proper orientation. Now, on the back side of the caliper, it's held on with an E-Torx, which is an open Torx, and it is 9/16. So, and one other step before you really get too deep into this is to hit everything with a little bit of WD-40. So be hitting the axle nut, let that soak in, as well as a few of the back sides of bolts on the rear of the suspension that can't really, neighbor of mine, rear side of the suspension, that to let it soak in. So we'll go ahead and hit all those. Sorry, it is hot and I am sweaty out here. I'm glistening like a pig. So in case you're wondering, open Torx, this is a, it's a 12-point wrench. It's a 6-point open Torx in the car. Now, it is 9/16 in size, and I've had people ask, well, can you just use a 9/16 socket? Yeah, I guess, but you run the risk of rounding off the bolt head. So I use an actual open Torx 9/16 and a second wrench to apply additional torque to this. So we'll go ahead and use this. Now the bolts, there are 2 bolts that hold the caliper on, and you get to the bolt heads from the back. Now what you can do is use a second wrench to apply additional torque to the first wrench. They lock together as such, and then you can go ahead and break them loose. So there's there. And then the top one. Now once you've cracked them loose, you can use a 9/16 socket and ratchet to loosen it the rest of the way up. So there's one. You can see what that open Torx bolt head looks like. So we'll pull the other one out now. Oh, one thing I almost forgot. Before you take the caliper totally loose, is you need to release this axle bolt. Almost forgot that. So let me show you that. So that is 1.25 inches. If I believe correctly, it is a 32mm will also work, but 1.25 inch socket. Just commit yourself to going to the store and getting an 1.25 inch socket. And so with the brake locked, you can loosen up this axle nut. So we'll get that loose. Now we'll finish taking the caliper bolt off. All right, the other bolt, same as the first. Now you're also going to want to have a soft-faced or maybe dead blow mallet that you can hit the rotor to knock it loose off the hub. On this side it came off. The other side I really had to wail on it a couple times, but this is a plastic mallet I made years ago. Delrin block, tapered titanium handle. This is a piece of tapered titanium tubing meant for a bicycle fork. Anyway, I just made this for fun close to 30 years ago. Anyway, soft face dead blow hammer to release the rotor and caliper. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The rotor and caliper will want to hang. You'll need to hang that assembly, which is pretty heavy. And there is the emergency brake wires as well as the brake line, and you really don't want to hang it by that. Theoretically, it will hang just fine, but I would prefer to use a wire. Now, I have a piece of welding wire here. You can use one of those old-fashioned metal coat hangers if you'd like. So what I do is loop this around the rear suspension spring, and then I'll stick it through the flat emergency brake wire bracket on the caliper. So we'll lift that off and support the weight with my hand here. It's a little awkward, but feed the wire through and then bend it around. And then it'll kind of hang out of the way between the steel lower suspension arm and the plastic skirt. But that wire there is pretty important. You can see I've got the wire wrapped around the suspension spring and down to the brake caliper, and that way you don't have tension either on the brake hose or on this emergency brake locking wire for the emergency brake motor, which is here. Next thing we're going to do is remove the ABS sensor from the knuckle. and that is held with a 10mm bolt behind the plate here. And you'll know you found it because there's a thin wire here running to that component, but you got to make sure you get that off, because if you don't remove the ABS sensing wire, when you pull the knuckle off, that's a pretty thin wire and it can get damaged easily. So you want to find this small wire. We are at the front side of the knuckle, and it goes down here and around to that. That's a 10mm bolt, so we need to remove that bolt to get the sensor out, and then you can pop this rubber grommet out. I'll show you how that pops off, but I'll go ahead and get my 10mm socket and remove that. So there's the ABS sensing lead. So you remove that and just let it kind of hang out of the way. Make sure you don't catch on anything. So next is to pull off the suspension arms. There are 4 separate suspension arm connections to the knuckle, as well as the sway bar link connection. Now, to remove the suspension arms, there are 2 different metric sizes used. There's 18mm and 21mm. So we'll go ahead and use those. There is a bolt with a nut on each side, and so if you're rotating the nut and the bolt is loosing or vice versa, you can grab it with another wrench. But you don't want to use just an open end or adjustable crescent wrench to loosen these. You definitely want a boxed end wrench or potentially a heavy duty socket and breaker bar. Although I found that for this job, these open end wrenches work the best, because especially for the upper link, you really can't, it's difficult to get a ratchet and a socket up in there. So, and again, I've already hit those with WD-40, so they should come off relatively easily. So I'm going to start with the upper link, and then what you want to do is you want to leave the lowermost link that is attached to the spring perch lower suspension arm. And the reason for that is you want to be able to, you can crack that one loose, but you want to remove that one last, because you want to be able to rotate the knuckle down to pull the axle out. And that is a great point for that to hold the knuckle. It's also the strongest arm in the suspension, so you can sweep that knuckle down to pull the axle out, and I'll be showing you that shortly. Now what I'm actually going to do is break loose all of the bolts, remove the nuts off of all 4 suspension arms. That way the knuckle is held in place while I deal with all of them, and then I can slide the bolts out separately. So that's what I'm doing here. All right, next to come off is the sway bar link, and that is 5/8, and then when you take the nut off, the sway bar ball that goes into the arm itself will want to rotate, and the way that you hold that back from happening is you use an Allen wrench. I'm sure it's a metric size, but I found the 3/16 Allen wrench, same Allen wrench I use for my adjustable screen mount kits, does work properly for that, so to retain that ball. So we're going to go ahead and do that next here. More glistening. All right, so if you remember when I jacked the car up, I mentioned that I want to jack up both sides for a couple of reasons. One is to reverse the tires, flip them left and right sides, but also if you jack up just one side, you end up with asymmetrical loading on the suspension. So the sway bar is torqued, and then you can't pull the sway bar bolt out easily. So we're going to go ahead and now remove the sway bar bolt, and this will be a whole lot easier since both sides are jacked up at the same time. So came right out. So now we'll go ahead and remove the suspension bolts, tap them through, and pull the knuckle down. Also, you can go ahead and remove the large axle nut. Well, I'm going to leave that partially on for a bit, and I'll address that in a minute. One other thing to comment on is my Mountain Pass Performance adjustable camber suspension arm. I installed these to correct the camber for my 1-inch lowering kit when I put the wider wheels on the back, and they work great. However, Tesla doesn't want to do any rear suspension or rear end work on this thing with aftermarket suspension arms on it. They mentioned that for safety reasons they can't install aftermarket suspension, so to remove these arms means they would have to install new ones and I'd have to pay for new ones. So what I'm going to do, since I'm messing up the camber anyway, pulling the suspension all the way apart, or since I'm messing up the alignment anyway, pulling the suspension all apart, I'm going to go ahead and put the stock upper arms on. I already did that on the right side. That way, should the clunk remain that I'm trying to resolve by replacing these knuckles, and I bring it back to Tesla for further diagnosis, these aftermarket camber arms won't be an issue. They're easy to install again later, but the car's going to have to go in for an alignment anyway, and with the stock camber arms in place, the wheels are at, I think, a 2.5 degree, anyway, I could be getting this wrong, but they're cambered in a little bit, but the alignment shop said it was still reasonable. They'd prefer a little less camber, but they said it was still fine. The tires did last quite a while that way, although I did notice a little bit of additional wear on the inside of the tires. Really not bad at all. It was slight, but it was there. So, but anyway, a lot of talking, but I'm going to go ahead and put the factory upper arms back on when I reassemble the car. So with all of the suspension arms removed, suspension arm bolts other than the large one for the spring perch arm, we're going to go ahead and tap the axle. I left the nut on there loose and past the end of the axle. This is a soft-faced mallet, but if you're using a regular hammer, you'll want to use, which you never want to do on this kind of thing, you never want to use a hard hammer or sledgehammer, but if you do want to tap on the end of a threaded shaft or bolt, always thread a nut onto the end and leave the nut sticking above the height of the head of what you're tapping. So there we go. It just released itself. So now we'll remove the nut all the way. Set that aside and push on the axle while the knuckle rotates down. And oh, I mentioned marking this, so let me go ahead and do that now. I took a picture of it to see the way the hub aligns with the backing plate, but I'm also going to mark it. We'll take a Sharpie and we'll mark the stud and then a line right there for alignment purposes. Excellent. Now that we have it aligned, so we know how to put it back together to get the rotor to line up with the bolts and the caliper to line up with the mounting tabs, we can go ahead and disassemble it. So push the axle through, let the knuckle rotate down. Now the axle's loose. Now, if you really wanted to, at this point, you can see the axle is loose. The axle could be removed completely from the car if an axle replacement is being accomplished. Now with all the suspension bolts out and the axle loose and the sway bar link removed, we've also got the ABS sensor lead removed. Double check that all that is off. Now you can go ahead and remove the knuckle. So, and there's your suspension knuckle removed and ready to swap the rear axle and bearing cartridge and brake shield over to the other knuckle. All right, so once you get the knuckle off, you'll need to set it on the ground and then remove these 3 bolts to get the axle and bearing assembly out. Those bolts are 18 millimeter. So I'll go ahead and remove those next. So what you do is you loosen them somewhat till they're up maybe a ½ inch or so, and then you can tap down lightly on them to release the bearing assembly out of the knuckle housing. All right, so what you want to do is set your replacement knuckle next to your old one and remove these 3 Torx head bolts to remove the shroud, so I'm using an impact driver for this. There's one. Two. Three. And move the shroud over in the same orientation. You can see I scratched a little mark to correspond with this slot. Didn't have my marker with me, so I just scratched a spot. So we'll go ahead and hand thread a couple of the Torx screws in. Now we'll go ahead and drive them all in. There we go. So now I'll install the axle bearings, the wheel bearing and hub carrier assembly back into the new knuckle and install it in the car. Alright, so I've got the axle hub and bearing assembly moved back over to the new knuckle along with the brake shield. So now we'll go ahead and reinstall it, just kind of reverse the process. The first thing I want to do is install the lowest, most knuckle bolt. You'll also notice, and I saw this on both sides, these tabs are kind of squeeze inward. So I'm going to go ahead and use my adjustable crescent wrench to bend these tabs open a little bit to facilitate insertion of the knuckle into that arm. So we'll go ahead and flex those out. You don't want to bend them real far, just give them a little bit of a flex. So, wish me luck. Oh, one other thing is line the marks back up that you put there at the one lug and on the shroud, so that this hub is lined up properly to get the brake disc and caliper back. So once you have this main bolt installed, put the nut on there since I've got good access to it. You can slide it back up on the spline. Now there's grease from the factory on these splines, and you want to re-grease those. So we'll go ahead and do that. So once you've put some grease on the splines, you can go ahead and insert the axle. Now again, if you're doing this by yourself and you don't have anybody in the car to help you unlock the brake, then you want to make absolutely sure that the hub is lined up on the splines properly so you can get the brake disc and caliper assembly reinstalled correctly. Alright, well, I'm back. So was glistening like a pig so badly that I had to go inside and change my clothes. Had to kind of clean myself off a little bit, dry off, and still sweating. It's like high 80s, super high humidity. So anyway, I got all the suspension arms reattached. Now one thing that you want to do, what I typically do, is I will feed each bolt through its opening, and then when I put the nut on that bolt, I crank it down tight, so that way you can't forget. Nevertheless, it is a good idea to go around each one, make sure that they're all tight. Make sure you didn't forget any. Just to make absolutely sure. So next we're going to rehang the brake caliper and rotor, and I'll refer back to, again, this mark I put on the hub and the brake shield. That mark is to make sure that the splines are lined up so this hub is in the right spot, so when I put the rotor and caliper assembly back on, it will line up. If you've got two people to work with and one person can be sitting in the car, the brake will unlock and you can work with the caliper and rotor separately. But in my instance, since I'm one person, the rear brakes are locked, so I had to leave the caliper locked to the rotor, take them off as a unit. So again, that mark was there to have everything lined back up. So got it hanging by the wire here. I'm going to pull it out and disconnect the wire, the tension wire that it's hanging by, and reinstall it. You can see the wire that I attached to the emergency brake wire harness bracket, and then to the suspension spring. You attach a wire there, and then there's enough slack that you can remove this and let it hang. Don't forget to remove your safety wire. You'd hate to leave that on there and be driving around with it moving around inside the car. Now, one of the last steps is to put this axle nut back on, and that's because you got the caliper locked to the disc, to the rotor, holding the axle stub still while you snug this nut down. All right, so there you go. I will be, the next step is I'm going to clean out the inside of the wheels, and as I mentioned before, I'm going to be rotating them, putting the right rear wheel on the left side and vice versa for even wear purposes. So before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and take this opportunity to clean the inside of the wheels that I can rarely ever get to. So that's it. My advice is take your time. Take your time, just work through it. And yeah, I think that too many people have been afraid to work on Teslas. And I'll be honest with you, that when it comes to the electronic side, I don't understand it. I don't know CAN bus and all that other jazz that a lot of the internet geniuses understand. But other than the electronic side of it, the mechanicals, it's just a car. I mean, it's a car. I don't want to say just a car. It's a wonderful car, but it's a car. And so you can work on it like any other car. And in fact, I would say Teslas are easier to work on than a number of the other cars that I've had to work on in the past. And that truth is borne out by talking to other mechanics that have worked on the car for me. They've commented that, wow, never worked on a Tesla. This is an easy car to work on, which is true from a mechanical standpoint. So anyway, I'm pretty proud of this. Tavares has got nothing on me. I'm just kidding. Don't flame me in the comments section. There's no way I would take apart a McLaren like Tavares. Although, well, maybe so. I would just never get it back together again. So anyway, this repair, it took about 2 hours of actual work per side. The right side I did off camera, and I did that mainly because I wanted to learn what to do so that I could give you guys a more in-depth, more knowledgeable instructional video on how to accomplish this. And admittedly, it took me 3 trips to the hardware store to accomplish this. So the tools that you're going to need are a 9/16 open Torx wrench. You're going to need a piece of wire to support the brake caliper. You're going to need a number 18 and 21 millimeter open end wrenches. You will probably need a crescent wrench to hold the nut on the other side. Probably good to have a 9/16 socket with a small ratchet, and then a 10 millimeter socket with, this is just a screwdriver handle to get that ABS sensor off. And then the Big Daddy, a 1 1/4 inch socket with long breaker bar to get that nut off, and a can of either penetrating oil or WD-40 to loosen things up, and then preferably a mallet, a soft-faced mallet, or even a dead blow mallet would be better. So those are the tools that you're going to need, along with obviously a lug wrench and a jack and jack stands. So that's it for me for today, guys. I really appreciate you tuning in. I've got some other technical videos coming up. I'm going to be doing a DIY small paint flake off and surface rust repair on the front of the car. It sounds like a big deal, surface rust. It's the paint came off. It is there's just the tiniest little bit of light hazing on the metal. It's no big deal. So I'll be cleaning that, treating it, using probably an undercoating type of spray on product, and then some simple spray paint. It's down under the rockers behind the front wheels. That's a video that I have coming up. I just got the full self-driving computer installed. Absolutely awesome. I have a video coming up on that, as well as production updates on the pivoting screen mount kits, and neighbor driving by there. Good guy driving a Mini Cooper. So anyway, a lot of cool videos coming up in the future, so go ahead and subscribe. Click the notification bell so you know when these videos are coming up, and the next time you see this car, it'll be all back together again. All right, so you can see the work that was done. Now this work, oh gosh, it took me about, I'd say 6 hours total to do the left side and the right side. This video was 2 hours from start to finish. All the labor was 2 full hours. That includes taking out all of the tools, putting them all away, and I had already done the right side. Now the right side took me about 3.5 hours, maybe closer to 4 hours. But part of that, though, is to do the right side, I made 3 separate trips to the hardware store. This video, this was a tough one. This was a tough one. I mainly replaced these components to deal with a clunk coming from the rear. I don't know if you can hear it or not. When I let off and then floor it, I get a clunk coming from under the trunk of the car. And so I brought it into Highland Park Tesla, and I was told that it was the loose suspension knuckles that were doing it. And then I also had a bad rubber drive unit mount. Well, the rubber drive unit mount I opted to have done, but it was going to be well over $2,000 to replace the rear knuckles, and not a small job to do, and not inexpensive parts. So I opted to just have them do the rubber motor mount, or drive unit mount, which is something that I was unable to do because you have to drop the whole drive unit cradle to do it. Whereas for me, I was able to do the suspension knuckles. So I tried getting the play of those knuckles on video, but you couldn't really see it. But basically, if you jack the car up, you could take each wheel and move it a little bit. It wasn't the wheel bearings, it was actually the upper heim joint, or well, they're not heim joints, but the upper pivots on the knuckles, both left and right side, that were loose. So Tesla said those were clunking. Well, maybe they were, but I just replaced those knuckles, and I got them used from eBay. It was $95 per side, which was cheap. Most people charge twice that. These both happened to be off one crashed car with only, I think it was 6,000 miles on it, and they were just parting the whole thing out. I made them an offer and bought them. They were in very, very good condition. I checked. There was no play in any of the joints on these knuckles. The old knuckles had play in them. The new knuckles are solid as anything, but my clunk is still there. So kind of frustrating that the clunk is still there, but there is some driveline lash both in the axles and in the differential. So I don't know. I just want to make sure it's not an internal drive unit failure, because that's still under warranty. And if the knuckles had play, which they did, actually quite a lot, you could really feel it, although it didn't show up on camera, but you could feel it and hear it back and forth as you move the knuckles. So that's all corrected now. So those needed to be replaced anyway. I'm glad I did it. I saved myself about $2,000 in doing this project, but my drive unit clunk is still there. So I'm glad I replaced those knuckles, but we still have to address the clunk. Now, a number of people are going to ask, well, I've lowered the car and I have wider wheels at the rear. Did this cause premature wear on the knuckles? Possibly. I'm definitely open to that. In fact, probably. I don't think it made them go bad, but I think that the wear on those knuckles will be accelerated by my wider. I went to 10-inch wide wheels from the 8.5-inch wide, and the whole car has been lowered an inch. So there is definitely more load on those knuckles than the stock car with stock wheels, stock ride height would give. So I'm definitely open to the thought that I have accelerated the wear on those. Nevertheless, the car has 84,000 miles on it, and it's been pretty good. So anyway, that's it for me for today. I appreciate you guys, I really do. Go ahead and leave a comment in the comments section below. If you have any questions, let me know. And yeah, look forward to doing some more DIY videos coming up in the future. I think a lot of people are scared of working on a Tesla, but a Tesla is a car like any other car, and you shouldn't be scared of it, but you should be as knowledgeable as possible whenever you work on any vehicle. So I need to have the car aligned. That's the next step, but for now we're good. So thanks a lot, guys, for tuning in, and as always, stay charged. Bye-bye now.